Okay, let's see. We are on 1 Kings chapter 10. And this is the greatest chapter in Israel's history in terms of what it was intended to be. This is really the Camelot that might have been and was for a brief sojourn, very brief moment. In spite of the fact that we saw in chapter 9 and other chapters that there was a measure of compromise in Solomon, nevertheless, God in his grace gave him far more than he might have otherwise deserved. And even though he did not really fully follow the law, and we well know that from a lot of evidences, nevertheless, he still blessed him and gave him a sense, a clarity of power, of wisdom, and of wealth, all the things that really one might have wanted, but at the same time should realize there's a danger in doing. If you recall, before you go further on that there was Deuteronomy, in Deuteronomy 17, you recall this, that there's a text of Scripture. Yeah, I'd like you to learn this. I mean, go back there and read this for yourself. Study this text. It's very important because most people never even notice this. But the fact is that the king, this is 400 years before they'd have a king, Moses was told by God, this is what you will do when you have a king, because you will have a king after this, and that we know that it would be after the period of Judges when the Lord their God was their king. So it went from a theocracy to a monarchy. But here's what would be happening here. When you get a king, they should not multiply horses, wives, or silver and gold. And so you have power, sex, and money right there. And so people haven't changed, as we've seen. The same temptations, though the cultures change, the temptations, the human heart is still the same. But instead, in green, I've written, there are also to be positive things they were supposed to do. Namely, they were to be men of the word and be under authority. Because you see, under the word, they were supposed to write out a copy of the Mosaic law in their own handwriting on a tablet, and they were to actually, on tablets, and they were to actually write this out, and this would be something they personally would read the rest of their lives, so that they would have humility and wisdom to judge the people correctly. Furthermore, when they were to do that, the writing was to be done in the presence of the Levitical priests, so there would also be men who were under authority. So you see that the three things they weren't supposed to have, they multiplied in abundance, almost all of them. The two things they were supposed to do, I'm not aware of anyone who ever did it, not one. Any more than I'm aware that they ever actually kept the Jubilee year. They never did that either. A lot of things that were never done. It's amazing. Again, the more you study this, the more you realize how God had to put up with a lot of pushback against his sovereign rule, because they didn't simply trust him. And it comes down to that. If you can't trust the Lord your God, you're not going to obey him. And the problem and that's our problem today as well. If you can't trust him, you're not going to obey him. And so who do you trust is what it comes down to. But the net of the matter is that it's beyond what men can basically endure, what very few people can manage, that degree of notoriety, of that degree of power and wealth and influence. And as a consequence then, there was a diminishment. But before that, though, this was the way it was meant to be. The account of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, this is beginning to happen during the righteous portion of his reign. And she would actually have a context in which is a rare instance in which the reality exceeded the rumors. And so what we have her saying is this. This is what the Queen of Sheba says after her visit to him. Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel. The Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness. Now these are on the lips of a foreign woman. And how did that happen? How did this woman then come to believe that the living God was actually in Israel? It's because this is the way it was intended to be through the covenants. As you recall, the various covenants that you had with the Abrahamic and following were covenants that were designed to protect the people. And so the Abrahamic Covenant was an unconditional covenant, and recall that it included three conditions: land, seed, and blessings. And those land, seed, and blessings components were broke out into three subsequent covenants that supplemented it. There was the land covenant. I don't call it Palestinian, although it's commonly called that because it was never called Palestine, and it's not a biblical term. It was a pejorative term by the Romans, so never use that word. It was the land covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. And those three have to do with you will have you will be in this place, and you will always have someone, a king, who will rule over you, and so that there will be a whole dynasty, an eternal dynasty and then finally the new covenant, which we enjoy. So you and I are recipients of the new covenant, and its complete fulfillment has not yet been realized. But those covenants, the important point here, is that this Abrahamic covenant was unconditional. The Mosaic covenant was conditional and temporary, but this is permanent and ultimately will yield then permanent results. And so this is a very important, critical mindset for us to have in mind, that for us to see that these covenants that God established with the people were for their good and for their benefit and have been realized in history. So when we go to the text itself, then we're going to see some of the magnificence of what she is beholding. Remember the temple, and we saw a little video describing the temple and guesses as to what it was like. We don't know precisely. The descriptions are elaborate enough to where we have a pretty good idea, but it was magnificent. It was exquisite. And we have this idea of its elegance and its beauty. So this is guesswork based upon the realities, but it's pretty close. And this, as you know, not a bit of it is left, and it was completely destroyed by the Babylonians, as God himself predicted that it would be if they were to break covenant with him. So he even said so in this very book that we're reading, that ultimately, if you do not keep covenant with me, I will make this place a house of hissing rather than of blessing. It'll be a place where we will wonder what happened, and it was an evident destruction. So God's not committed to those institutions. He's committed to his people. He's never been committed to institutions as such. He's committed to the people. So you have a very powerful picture here, and so I'll go to that in a moment. So as we read our text, we have this context here when we see that speaking about his wealth and some of the things he did in his organization that we saw a couple of weeks ago. We see as well then that when the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with difficult questions. It's interesting, his fame, what does it also say? Concerning the name of the Lord. So they were connected together, and that the fame of God, of Yahweh, of the covenant God who made heaven and earth, utterly different than all the gods of the surrounding nations, who would use, as you know, images, manifestations, grotesque gold and silver things like Moloch, which would actually have the arms where they would put actually infant sacrifices on the arms and so forth, and others as well where they would actually cruelly burn them inside. And these were brutal, ugly images, and those who make them will become like them, as the scriptures say. But what about Israel's temple? Go back to what we saw here. You're not going to see an image. Not an image of God. Now, there are images, and so it's not to say that you couldn't use images in the sense of, because we see that they were palm trees and pomegranates and cherubim and so forth. That's why it always struck me as odd that the Puritans felt that the prohibition against images should therefore apply to the church in this setting. But it didn't mean ornamentation and beauty. It would mean something that you would worship or idolize. You see, that's the difference. Because as a result, it led to a really, the diminishment of beauty in the evangelical tradition in profound ways. It's profound. Most church buildings are hideously ugly. I'm just going to tell you, they're just ugly things. And it's just, and the worship and the liturgy isn't that great either. So to be honest with you, so I'm not impressed with, now I'm really whining. But what I'm telling you is I have to make my peace because you see, I'm looking for something that doesn't exist yet on earth, not the fullness. I've had wonderful experiences. Don't get me down wrong, because I have had wonderful, rich fellowship with people and in certain contexts as well. And in fact, the idea of having the Spirit and the Scriptures and the sacraments and service, those four combined together, those four S's, that's a powerful combination. The Spirit, the Scriptures, the sacraments, and service to other people. And it's a very unstable compound and doesn't last for long. It's amazing. But that said, no images to be worshipped, and that's what made it unique. There were no other temples of this nature. There was always a figure that was inside of them. And so she comes to test him with these questions. And so she comes with a large retinue. Well, where did she come from? There are guesses that we have, and one of those guesses has to do, let me just get my little map here. So Solomon's empire, you recall, then extended up all the way up in terms of influence up to the Euphrates and down to the Wadi al-Arish, the river of Egypt. And then another image gives us a picture, a broader picture. And it's thought that Sheba might have been where Yemen is now. There are some different views on that. And so again, it might have been called Saba, but Sheba would be over here, according to this map. We don't know for sure, but this gives us an idea. It was in this possible area here. Some take it that it was in south of Egypt. But regardless of that view, you've got this picture of her coming from a long distance with camels carrying spices, very much gold and precious stones. She had great wealth. When she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. Solomon answered all her questions. It's an interesting thing. She comes as an intelligent woman, a powerful woman, a woman who comes because she's drawn by the word about wisdom, that there is a greater wisdom in Israel than in any of the nations. The Egyptians prided themselves on their sages, and there were traditions of wisdom literature in Egypt, but none of this even came close to the wisdom of Solomon, who spoke 1,005 songs and did all these wonderful discourses on all aspects of nature. He was a naturalist, he was a scientist, he was a philosopher, he was a brilliant man. The world had never seen a mind like that, and would never until one other mind, far, far greater than his, would be incarnate, and that would be the incarnate Logos, who spoke all things into being in our Lord Jesus. Other than that, yet this most intelligent of men, and wise for a period of time, didn't lose his intelligence, but he lost his wisdom. You see, because wisdom doesn't have to do, or folly. To be a fool doesn't mean that you have intellectual deficiency. It means that you have a moral deficiency. That means that you're not applying life as it ought to be. You can be very wise, very, very intelligent and be foolish. But the real issue then is what one does with these skills that God has granted us. So he answered all her questions. This is a woman who tested him out. She didn't believe the legend, the rumor. Nothing was hidden from the king which he did not explain to her. When the queen of Sheba perceived all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, and remember, he built the temple, and it took 7 years to build that. But then his house was no shack. It took 13 years to build the thing. It was impressive. It must have been a marvel. We don't have any description of it, so we have to just do guesswork. But it must have been a wonderful, beautiful palace, and exquisite, laid out beautifully. And then she was able to see this house, and then the food of his table. So she notices the way everything is done, the deportment, the service, even the way they attend their attire, the attendance of his waiters and their attire, his cupbearers, and the stairway by which he went up into the house of the Lord. It says there was no more spirit in her. She was breathless when she saw that. That's really what it means. She was breathless. She was taken away. And this is an amazing statement that she makes. It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. Nevertheless, I did not believe the reports until I came and my eyes had seen it. This is why she came with difficult questions, to test him out. But then it's not just what she heard from his mouth, but also what she saw with her eyes, the expression of wisdom in so many multiple ways. And so she said, "Behold, the half was not told me. You exceed in wisdom and prosperity the report which I had heard." Now, how often does that occur? Again, when the reality exceeds the rumor. You see, it's an amazing thought. There weren't words to describe it. It was that great. So again, and you recognize as well that the people were doing abundantly well is because they were given freedom from their enemies. Their borders had greatly expanded. They had little disease because of God's grace upon them. You see, remember under a theocratic covenant nation, the blessings of righteousness were the fruit of the vine. You see, in the new covenant, however, the blessings of righteousness are not the fruit of the vine. There's no parallel or connection between obedient and righteous living and wealth and prosperity. Although the prosperity gospel purveyors would tell you otherwise. The name it, claim it, frame it, that collective there. Believe and receive. Blab it and grab it. I always love those phrases. It's yours. The word faith. And so this whole prosperity gospel, none of that's total nonsense. Because what you have in a covenant nation is a physical blessing, and a new covenant is a spiritual blessing. You see the difference there? And so the idea here, but that therefore all the people were elevated in a great power and great position in terms of living well. So she says, "You exceed in wisdom and prosperity the report which I heard. How blessed are your men! How blessed are these your servants who stand before you continually and hear your wisdom." Isn't that a wonderful thing? Again, this woman from a foreign land who would not have been, of course, a believer when she was in her country about the Mosaic law and the covenants that were given. Yet through you all the nations of the earth will be blessed, because when they see Israel as it's meant to be, it would become a light to the rest of the world. And because of that, people would be drawn to Yahweh. And so all the nations of the world would be blessed. As it turns out, that would occur, but not in this context. It would occur in the new covenant, where that would be, and then Israel's rejection of their king, in fact, led to the blessings of the nations. This is why Jesus, remember when he first said, "I have only come to seek the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But then at the end, after his rejection, go into all the world. So that rejection, and Paul in Romans 11 says, actually, in God's incredible wisdom, he shut all up into disobedience so that he could show grace and mercy to all. So it was necessary for this to happen and for our advantage, because if the natural branches were cut off, then unnatural branches were grafted contrary to nature. Will not also God regraft the natural branches and put them back? Because ultimately Israel's condition is only partial. Their hardening is only partial and temporary. But ultimately all Israel will be saved, he says in Romans 11, and discusses that. Because again, my view here is that the whole matter is about the kingdom. And that's what the emphasis is, in the gospel of the kingdom. And so where does the church fit in? Well, I think the church is the bride of Christ who will rule and reign with him in the kingdom. So the real end game is not the church. The end game is the kingdom. But the church is going to be his bride who rules and reigns. And that's why I think of Christianity, as I often say. I used to say it's not a religion, it's a relationship. But now I'll also say it's not a religion, it's a romance. Because he woos and pursues and calls and nurtures his bride, which is, and so ultimately then we are privileged to be part of that bride of Christ. Jew and Gentile are in it. And so how blessed are your men, they hear your wisdom, and you have this great material blessing that was evident, but manifest in so many ways. Blessed, she goes on to say, the Lord your God, who delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel. So she is now saying, she's coming away from seeing this, and what is happening? She is blessing the Lord God himself because of what's happening. And so she goes away and says, God, in fact, she has the understanding. He's the one who sovereignly planted you on the throne. And why did he put you on the throne? Because he loved his people. Therefore, he made you king to do justice and righteousness. Now, these are incredible words for her to say. It's my belief then she became a proselyte. And ultimately, that was the way it was meant to be. So when this powerful and intelligent woman goes up to test him out with difficult questions, and he exceeds anything she could have imagined, not only in his wisdom and words, but also in his deportment and his cupbearers and everything that they did, all the elegance, the beauty. Everything was done with dignity and with excellence. It's like going from let's say, a little shack to a cathedral, So when you think about, it's like a cathedral of beauty. And you see, this is the wonderful thing. I might parenthetically mention, though, that it's intriguing that God causes us and calls us to be sub-creators. You might say co-creators or sub-creators. We take the raw material that he gives us, and being image bearers, we are then called to shape it and fabricate things and to create things. And so he does things in us and through us, you see. Not one of the things that we create is going to be as marvelous and mysterious as anything that God's made in the natural world. Any cell will do. We'll never be able to make a cell. Our technologies, we gush about our technology, it's inferior to nature. We can't retro-engineer nature. It only reveals a greater mind, and the more you learn about it, the more wonderful it becomes. On every order of magnitude, the James Webb will show, and the technology will show more and more on the macro, and we're seeing more and more in the micro, and on the midi-cosm, it's getting more wonderful to see. So we see here that God has manifested himself in wonderful ways. But God he chose not to build a cathedral. He calls us to do that. He never wrote a sonnet. We do that. He never wrote a play. You see where I'm going with that? This idea, he's the architect, but he calls us to then manifest his works to bring into being things that didn't exist, because we're bearers of the Imago Dei, because we're spiritual beings, because he's a spiritual being. You're a relational being, because he's a relational being, and only the Trinitarian vision of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is big enough for it to be relational, because it takes more than one person for there to be love. We're also then, because of beauty and goodness and truth, these transcendentals. Beauty is the way he approaches us in the natural world. And because he's beautiful, we are aesthetic beings. Because he is good, we are moral beings. Because he is true, we are rational beings. Beauty, goodness, and truth, the fundamentals. That's their nexus, that's their foundation. Any atheist has no ultimate basis for describing why would a thing be beautiful, good, or true. You see, what makes a thing right and wrong? It would just be a utilitarian ethic. We have a deeper way of understanding the things that men long for and want to have. And indeed, we also have a greater capacity for things that we could have otherwise done. That's why I see in heaven, you're going to be, as a creator, you're going to continue to garden and make wonderful things. And all that you know that you can't do now, you'll be able to do, and beyond. Your capacity is so much greater than your contribution. Your ability is so much greater than your accomplishments. You know that. That's a hint of home, if you really begin to train yourself to see it that way. But I now will get away from my sermonette and continue on the text. Because he loved Israel. So here's a picture then of the way it was meant to be. She gave the king 120 talents of gold. That's no small amount. And a very great amount of spices. A talent's about 75 pounds. And precious stones. Never again did such abundance of spices come in as that which the Queen of Sheba gave King Solomon. You wonder what those were like, you see. And the cuisine of Israel was a great deal better for a period of time. Also the ships of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophir, brought in from Ophir a number of almug trees and precious stones. Now going back to our map for a moment, we just again look at Hiram, and we're talking here about Tyre. So we go way up here, And the men of Tyre were the ones who actually had the cedar and the skill and bring the cedars up and fabricating that and other things as well. So Hiram was a king, and they would have ships that would go off to Tarshish, which was actually where Jonah was headed. And Tarshish was actually around Spain, you see. So it's a long distance, but these ships from Tarshish would go and bring wonderful things. A great number of almug trees and precious stones. This is a guess. This is what they look like actually, and wonderful things can be made from them. You see this beautiful wood, so like this. So, and I call your attention to that because they use these almug trees, some beautiful wood, and so this wood was used then for support for the house of the Lord and for the king's house. Also lyres and harps for the singers. That's why I showed you that image. So it was a beautiful material. Such almug trees have not come in again, nor have they been seen to this day. So it was just an interesting thing. The spices, this glory, it was remarkable. Then what did he do? He gave to the Queen of Sheba all her desire, which she requested, besides what he gave her according to his royal bounty. So there were sharings of gifts, as that would be customary. Each would give gifts to the other. And then she turned and went to her own land together with her servants. And you wonder as well, in the providence of God, how many of her servants also, who beheld the same wonders, became proselytes, you see. Because this is the way it was meant to be. That was the Camelot of Israel in this wonderful chapter. And I hate to turn to the next chapter, because I know what's going to happen. I keep hoping it'll be different next time. You ever reading Genesis 1 and 2, and you're hoping Genesis 3 will be better this time? Maybe instead of the silence of Adam may say, "Hey, this isn't a good idea. He's tempting you." Unbelievable. But no, it's going to happen that way. But we're going to discover that even these things are necessary. Necessary for a greater good, because this is not the best of all possible worlds, but it is the best possible way, apparently, to get to the best of all possible worlds. And that's why we are in a tragedy until it seems tragic that near the end of a comedy, doesn't it? The act before, it seems everything falls apart in the last act, it seems, and everything is then moving in disastrous ways. Think of a Shakespearean comedy. Which one comes to mind? Lewis is not with us, is he? Much Ado About Nothing, or think about Midsummer Night's Dream. Those are two good examples of how everything starts well and then gets in worse and worse until everything's totally distorted and destroyed because of misconstruals and everything else. But then somehow a deus ex machina, something comes in and sorts everything out. And then what happens is they're all better people than they were when they started. Because in the character arc of a good comedy, that means that what often happens in that narrative is that there is starts well, but then things fall apart and seem to degenerate. But it's through that actual pain that the protagonist discovers that what he was wanting was not what he needed. You see, so there's a development in the character itself. So the pain itself has a character arc that can be redemptive if it's a comedy. It's a comedy if they live. If it's a tragedy, that's the end of them. The main characters are all wiped out. But so what we are not in a tragedy, we're in a comedy, but it looks like a tragedy right now, and Jesus made it very clear, I promise you, in the days before I come, it's going to seem even more tragic. It'll be more tragic than anything you've ever seen before. I mean, I have a document about this concept, and I taught this on Friday in case you're interested. Unprecedented evidences for the last days. But I'll be going through I went through all these last Friday. But one of those things is exponential growth of information and technology, because men will go to and fro and knowledge will increase in the last days. And all the words are sealed up until that time. Just think about all the implications in interconnected one world economy, united Europe for the first time, a loss of moral absolutes, redefinition of sexuality, marriage, and the family, unprecedented degree of apostasy in the church. It's unbelievable. Even what people were evangelicals are now going into the woke theology and so forth. And it goes on and on, unprecedented number of false Christs and so forth. So if you're interested, you just need to you can go to the website and find it there, because the way you do that is go to kenbo.org, go to weekly studies, and then you go to the Friday morning study here. And so there, you'll see it right there. So it's there. Now, that digression, which was painful for you, well, but we'll continue. So the weight of gold which came into Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. That's well over $1 billion today. And besides that, from the traders and the wares of the merchants and all the kings of the Arabs and the governors of the country. So that's only a portion of it. Besides that, King Solomon had made 200 large shields of beaten gold. These were very expensive. 600 shekels of gold in each large shield, 300 shields of beaten gold, 3 minas. And the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. He made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with refined gold. There were 6 steps to the throne, and a round top to the throne at its rear, and arms on each side of the seat, and 2 lions standing beside the arms. Now he went in big time. You see, he didn't, if a little was good, more was better. Too much was just right, perhaps. 12 lions were standing on the 6 steps on each side. Nothing was made like it was made for any other time. And his drinking vessels were all of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None of silver was not considered valuable in the days of Solomon. And he had at sea the ships of Tarshish with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years, they'd go bringing, I love this collection, gold and silver, ivory, and apes and peacocks. Apes and peacocks. And he had a zoo, you see, and he was a naturalist. So he collected oddities and wonders from around the inhabited world of his time. I just wonder what it would have been like to have been there. So he became greater than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. All the earth was seeking the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. They brought every man his gift, articles of silver and gold, garments, weapons, spices, horses, and mules, so much each year by year. He gathered chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen. He stationed them in the chariot cities. And so silver was common. So he describes his import of horses and chariots and all these things that he did. So it was quite extraordinary. When I consider then if we go back to here, this might be this is a replication or some idea of what it might have been like when the Queen of Sheba visited him. So you can see her then, this elevated throne, and you can see these. We don't know exactly, but this is pretty close to the description of what it was like, where another image would be here. So something fabulous and amazing to behold. It was an impressive place. And just everything was done with such exquisite grace and care. The outfits that they would wear and everything they would do. So it was a great picture of glory and honor and praise. So when I consider these things, then I realize, though, that there's a great danger, because you see, there's a terrifying temporality because of all these things. And ultimately, the more we have, the more difficult it is to manage those things that we have. I think, again, money, sex, and power. Money, it's called Plutus, it's mammon, it's wealth or finances. And so it's one of these great, powerful things that are ubiquitous and universal. And sex, the goddess Aphrodite, Eros, and would be lust. I have females, you'll see why, because then you have fame, so I have to have my 3 F's there. Finances, females, and fame. Well, it's not, that's a weak one, I admit that. But that's not a great one. I can do better than that. Power, but again, Mars, you see, and Kratos, the idea of authority. And so these 3 poles in men's heart may become too much for them, because again, when you multiply these things, the more you have, the more difficult it is to walk by faith, isn't it? It'll just be more difficult for you to be a man of integrity who walks in humility before the Lord his God. And this question of gratitude and contentment will diminish. We will lose our gratitude for these things. And after a while, we will actually become less than what we were intended to be. I have this concept of gratitude. Just a little word about that. And in cultivating a heart of gratitude, in conformed to his image under process spirituality, I talk about this concept of what gratitude is about. And if we lose our gratitude, and I think this is what happens, Dostoevsky in his Brothers K said, if he is not stupid, he's monstrously ungrateful, phenomenally ungrateful. In fact, I believe the best, it's Note from the Underground, that's right. The best definition of man is the ungrateful biped. How is that possible? You know how I've put it this before. With the passage of time, what happens? Grace degenerates into entitlement. You're going to get this one down, you know. And it's true. It has gratitude has a very short half-life.
Where's your latte?
Where's my latte? Hey, I deserve that. It's been brought to me every day, but no, where's my latte? Well, you see, that's the mindset you have. In fact, I didn't thank you yet for this water. I don't want to take it. You don't want to presume on grace. That's my point. You see, when gratitude becomes redundant, something's eroded in your heart. So you want to be a person who chooses the way of gratitude, not of an amazement, really. Forgetfulness always leads to ingratitude. You see, here's what happens. We have a way of forgetting where we were and where we might be and where we would be going. And so when we forget these things, we then buy into the false notion that my hand made me this wealth, or whatever we have. Gratitude is a choice, not merely a feeling. So can a person be grateful even in times when things are not going well? And the answer is yes, because it says, rejoice always, in everything give thanks. Pray without ceasing. So if you're going to rejoice always, if you're going to give thanks in everything, that's what requires what is called the hard thanksgiving. The hard thanksgiving is no easy thing. Can I thank God? My child has just got this disease. How can I thank him for that? I can't thank him for the thing itself, but I can thank him for what he can do in it and through it. You see the difference? And how do I know what is best for that person? And how do I know? When I offer my prayers, I offer them up to him, but he himself knows and allows and pursues us and will often give us severe mercies that we do not want, because apart from which we wouldn't actually come to see our need for him. We forget our need for him, and that's why we become autonomous and arrogant, because we forget. You see, so I relate gratitude to remembering. You need to remember where you came from, where you are, and where you'd be. And it's a choice. So you have to choose the way. Though I don't like this, I can love you in it. Though I don't want this, yet I want you. And if you are sovereign, then I have to believe that your purposes will prevail in spite of appearances to the contrary. In fact, the entire world is this way, where Jesus has made it clear that you have not yet seen what God is preparing for those who love him, are called according to his purpose. We cannot give thanks and complain at the same time. So the key to anger, for example, for me is the idea of gratitude, of choosing the way of gratitude and grace. So if I'm grateful, I can't complain when I'm thanking him for something. You see the point here? And the one will replace the other. If you allow your emotions to rule, you'll succumb to circumstances. But if you allow your wisdom of choosing truth over feeling, and the truth is God's word, and his word is always so, and it is the way in which a person can live and walk, then we know that we can be grateful because he works all things together for good, for those who love him and are called to his purposes. But you see, and then fourth, we have to review it as a discipline. So that's why I invite you to see gratitude and remember as a daily discipline. Now, a friend of mine, Bill Fagan, used to describe certain dots that would happen in his life. Archie, you remember him. And so he would talk about something that would happen that just couldn't be explained. And he'd make that a note. He'd make a remembrance of that, like an Ebenezer, a stone of remembrance. And then another thing might occur, and it'd be another dot. And those are moments. And I believe God gives you dots, but you forgot your dots. You see, don't forget your dots. You need to actually memorialize them and have them as Ebenezer, stones of remembrance, so that when you are in a tough time now, then you can look back. He delivered me here and here and here. And if he did that, he'll also do it there, you see? So, and that's precisely what the psalmists would do in the Psalms of Lament. When they would actually, they would give their pain, they would give their complaint or their pain, but then they would then meditate upon God's works in the past and sometimes about God's promises for the future. By the end of the psalm, the circumstances didn't change, but they end with praise rather than grumbling. So that's the difference. So the key in life is not only to remember the dots, but then to connect the dots. You see, you connect them, because then you see patterns retroactively that you could not see proactively. It's always easy to look, and rear view mirroring is always easy. You can look back, but the fact is that we can to project forward. Who can guess? But looking back, I see patterns, and that's what I think we're invited to do sometimes when you reflect on your journey, is to discover the patterns and the sequences, the things that God took you through in your life journey. So this is very important, this idea of remembering. And so this is a very important text I want you to note this verse, Hosea 13:6. As they had their pasture, they became satisfied. And being satisfied, their heart became proud. Therefore they forgot me. Note the sequence then. First they had their pasture. So they had abundance. God blessed them, and He gave them rich and wonderful abundance. But given that abundance, they forgot who it was who gave it to them, you see. They forgot that He's the one who gives them the very life, blood, and breath in order to sustain the capacity. So they forgot that, and they became satisfied. You know what happens then when you become satisfied? You become complacent. And complacency leads to mediocrity every time. So this is why you have to have a greater desire. Don't be complacent, but actually pursue more, and more than you could actually imagine, because only God is big enough to satisfy your true desires. But if your values are anemic, then you become complacent. And I've talked about people have anemic values. They don't long for enough. They don't want enough. They don't desire enough. If anything, we should desire more, so much, in fact, that finally we admit that the world can't give it to us. You see the point? Make your desires that much. Don't desire some wealth on this world. That's too cheap and tawdry. You should desire better than that. You were meant for better than the wealth of this world. I don't care how many mansions and yachts and planes you've got and whatever else you've got. All that stuff you leave behind. There's no U-Haul behind a hearse. And you recognize that there is that you're going to leave it behind, and that a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions, does it? The problem is, most men, when they get a lot of possessions, begin to define their life in terms of those possessions. It's a natural tendency. The more you have, the more difficult it'll be to walk by faith, and the more you will be tempted to be proud and to believe that your hand made you this wealth. It's a dangerous pull to occur. And so this whole idea of the extremes in forgetting is that forgetting is goodness, you become presumptuous or you become resentful. You resent others' good fortune. How come I can't have that, you see? Or you become presumptuous. But the daily exercise of remembering, Henri Nouwen put it this way: every gift I acknowledge reveals another, and another, Until finally, even the most normal, obvious, seemingly mundane event or encounter proves to be filled with grace. I think he's right. Most people don't see it, just as they don't see nature very well. They haven't trained themselves. Train yourself to see the gifts of God, and you begin to realize you've taken much for granted. So it's often when we lose an ability that we then realize we should have been grateful for having it all along, you see. We should be grateful for getting out of bed, for being able to drive, on all the other things we can do. We take it for granted. Don't forget to thank God for the many little tender mercies and little blessings that he's given you. The blessings of having hot and cold running water. Just when's the last time you thanked God for that? Most people don't have it in the world, even today, let alone in the past. Nobody did, almost no one. So be amazed by that and look at what you have and what you took for granted. And my kitchen's too small. Are you kidding me? This is, they get bigger and bigger. You know, it's constantly, when they don't cook either. They don't cook. You're right. I've been in certain kitchens that are as large as the house I grew up in Dumont, New Jersey, in Emerson, New Jersey, as large as that house. And you're right, they don't cook, but they're very nice looking. So the daily exercise, don't forget, because when you forget, you become arrogant, autonomous, and you suppose that you did this. So don't forget God's deliverance in the past. Remember his deliverances in the past, God's benefits in the present. And so, and remember again, all this has been granted to us. It's not that we were so clever as to choose when to be born and where to be born and all those other things. We weren't. And then consider his promises for the future, which are as good as his character. So these are the things you want to remember. And it's not a bad thing to do at the beginning of the day. Again, the spiritual renewal cards, those of you who are using them, I hope you at least use the one for the morning. The love and gratitude is how we start, isn't it? Love and gratitude. And the gratitude can tease it out. Grateful for the beauty of his world. Grateful for my material blessings, my relational blessings, and my spiritual blessings. 4 levels, you see. And so, and fill that in. So, and then love and gratitude, and then that's followed by submit and depend. And depend I define as trusting the Father, abiding in the Son, walking by the Spirit, and then commit and obey. Well, that's a regular routine. Remember. Make it your routine that you do that. And so next week I want to talk about the secret of contentment. We did this last week, didn't we? But I want to tease it out a little bit more for you next week. Because the problem is when you have all this magnificence, all this splendor, all this wealth, the man was not content. He was not content. He was not satisfied because somehow he lost the cutting edge of spiritual desire. And when you lose that, you see, when you don't want God more than anything in the created order, you see, then you succumb to idolatry. Because at the end, then the idolatry of the world will come upon us. It'll oppress us with all these things. In their varying combinations, we'll have various pulls, but not one of these things will give you that. Not a one. None of those P's will give you the fruit of the Spirit. Yes?
What do you think, if you had to guess, was the first step in Solomon drifting?
There's so many little things, but I think that his heart was seduced by his quest for power. And the power would be achieved by creating alliances with other nations. So the Pharaoh's daughter, the daughter of Egypt, was the key one. He built a place for her, a virtual palace for her. And I think, therefore, it was the typical thing that really is the heart of all sin, and namely pride. And then the pride expresses itself in the quest for attainment and power. And so what happens, the invisible becomes more and more a quest for the visible. And like, instead of considering a church as an organism, a bride, a body, living stones, it's considered now buildings, budgets, and body count. You see? So something was wrong. What happens? We are men who hate to trust in the invisible, but we want to put our trust in the visible. Yet, last time I checked, what does Hebrews 11 say? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, which means you don't have them yet. They're not yet. The assurance of things not seen. And so, to put your hope in something you don't have yet and it's not seen over that which is visible and present tense is no easy task. And so our natural compass will be to look and see how others are doing. When we do that, we play a terrible game, because the game of comparison will always lead to kill your contentment every time.